Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 161 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is humility, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are looking at the potential parts of temperance still, and we do that right to the end until we get to the precepts. So we are looking at the part of temperance, which is modesty. And under modesty, we have these four categories here. So the first question is humility a virtue? And the answer is yes, it is a virtue. It's dealing with the appetites again, right? These are these passions, these emotions, and we're trying to hold them into check. Now, when somebody has a move of the appetite, this time it's aiming towards greatness, some great act. You need two moderating virtues to guide this. One is, presuming a person's a pretty good person, you want to achieve something that is great, but if it's what you're trying to accomplish is too far beyond you, and reason would dictate it's too far beyond you, your hopes are too high, as an example, then you need a virtue to moderate that hope to something that's more practical, right? So, as an example, and maybe I might not say this correctly, but I'm going to try. Like somebody like Saint Therese of Lisieux, in her journaling, pointed out how she wanted to be a priest and a missionary, and the list went on. She listed a dozen things she wanted to be, and what was she? She was a contemplative nun, right? If she actually tried to run and to pursue each of those things individually, she would have accomplished none of it, right? She wouldn't have done anything. And she wouldn't have been living according to her own vocation. Reason would have said, don't try to be all of these things that you can't be. Be who you are, right? Reason dictates that you should be who you are. Because of this, St. Therese has humility, right? She acted according to reason, right? It's not that she had a lack of hope. It's just she didn't hope for things that were beyond her, right? Somebody else was called to be a missionary. Somebody else was called to be a priest. She was called to be who she was. And humility recognizes within yourself who you are and what is the great thing that you are called to be in your being and in your circumstance, right? It's this matter of matter and circumstance, right? So in terms of being a woman in the 1800s and from a pious family and with her health situation, being a contemplative nun was exactly who she was called to be, and she did it well. So that's what happens when humility is practiced. Now, the other part of it is if a person is called to even bigger things and they don't attempt to pursue it, right? Because this pusillanimity, right, the smallness of soul, right, where one is called to be great and one attempts nothing, right? Then you need the opposite virtue to kick you into gear, right? It strengthens and urges you to go on. It moves you beyond despair. We covered this virtue in fortitude, magnanimity, where you say, I can't accomplish anything. I can't be a great nun. I can't do anything, right? Magnanimity says, enter that convent. You can do it. You have to take the first step. Again, reason is what dictates that you can achieve it, right? You can't be greater than you are, but you shouldn't aim for less than you are. This is that proper balance, and humility and magnanimity balance these to the proper order, right? Both of them are necessary. Now, is humility, the next question, is humility a matter of the appetite or a matter of the intellect? Is this a matter of a humble person just knows the right thing, or is it a matter of curbing the emotions? Is it a matter of getting your emotions on the right page. St. Thomas says it's about getting the emotions on the right page. It's not about knowing the right thing. A lot of times we know the right thing. It doesn't mean we're going to do the right thing. Right? It's not a matter of knowing. Humility isn't a matter of knowing. It's a matter of being, right, in our person. Knowledge is one of one's own deficiencies beyond, which belongs to humility. So in some ways it's knowing, right? It's not a matter of not knowing, right? Because it's according to right reason. So you have to know a certain amount. But it's really about moderating our appetites, not hoping for something which is beyond what hope can be. I know that seems to be a bit of a contradiction, that there's something beyond hope, but it's not the theological virtue of hope. It's within hope in a worldly way, in some sense. You can't hope for, if I say, I hope to be rich and famous and have all of this stuff, right? Otherwise I won't be happy. Well, I'm hoping for something that's not realistic, right? I'm hoping for something that's not going to happen in my life unless I win the lottery, which is somewhat unlikely since I hardly play the lottery. So it's usually hard to win when you don't play. This would be false hope, right? If all of my happiness is dependent on this thing which is not realistic, then I am going to fall into despair, right? Because it's a fake hope. It has to be something that is realistic. So if my hope is to make a video for each of the questions of the Summa Theologica, well, this can be accomplished within a year or two, so I believe I can do that. So that is a hope that is within my capabilities, and it's a big effort, though, right? It's a big effort. So it has the proper amount of magnanimity to accomplish it, but it's not beyond my ability. So humility keeps me within my ability. Now, is humility about subjecting yourself to your neighbor? Now, this one is a complicated one in the text. So I imagine if you read this, you might be a bit confused, or maybe I'm the only one that gets confused with it. But some of these lines are a bit confusing. So every man in respect to that which is his own ought to subject himself to every neighbor in respect for God. So insomuch as God is operating within our neighbors, sometimes better than God is operating within ourselves, we should subject ourselves to those for whom God is working more, in the degree that God works in the world through people. So, for example, the Pope and Bishop, for example, right? Your local bishop and the Pope. So if God is working through them, we should be respecting them to which degree God is working through them, right? Our local pastor, our local priest. To the degree in which God is working through the priest, we subject ourselves to that priest. And to our neighbor as well, right? You don't have to be ordained in order to have God working through you. Now, we don't submit for what God is doing in me to another. This is a very difficult thing, though, because to what degree is God working through me? Usually we're very oblivious to this, right? I don't know to what degree God is working through me right now. Sometimes years later when you look back, you can say, oh, I see it now. But in the moment, it's a bit of a tough challenge to say, don't let what God is doing in you be submitted to another, or even to what God is doing in another. And also don't submit your own humanness to another person's humanness. So it's really, in a narrow sense, submit yourself, your humanness, to the godliness that is working in another. Now, if you can find that out, that's a very good discernment, because that is not always perfectly clear. I think maybe this is a bad way of putting it, but I heard it one time, and I think it's a good way of looking at it, is to know who you are working for and who you are serving. So we work for God and we serve our brothers and sisters. right? I don't work for my brothers and sisters, right? I'm not a slave to my brothers and sisters. I'm a slave to God. I hand over all of my will, all of my action to God. Now, what does God do with it? He says, feed my sheep, serve one another. But that doesn't make me a slave to my brother and sister. I think that's a good kind of framing of how we do this. So to realize who are we subjecting ourselves to? We subject ourselves to God. And God works through other people, right? Particularly our superiors or people who God is working through. But we really work to serve our brothers and sisters. We are not subject specifically to our brothers and sisters. If we are all subjected to God, then that's enough, right? If we subject ourselves to God, then it gives us the freedom to serve one another. Now, is humility part of modesty and or temperance? And the answer is yes, clearly, because we are under the category of both temperance and modesty, so that's somewhat clear. So the mode of temperance is the resistance of impetuosity, of a passion. Now, impetuosity, very popular in the Middle Ages, not as popular in the 20th and 21st century. Impetuous is somebody, pediere is to rush, to jump into, to fly, and to jump into. Is into. So to jump into something, right? To jump into the passions. So it restrains us from jumping into the passions. In some ways, it's kind of a nice saying because pediere is like Petra, which means rock. And Peter was the rock, right? Peter was Petere in some ways because he is both the rock and impetuous, right? He jumped out of the boat to see Christ. St. Peter was frequently one that jumped. He jumped into, and then shortly after it said, kind of found himself in a crisis situation. I will never, abandon you, Christ. I will never reject you. And what is he doing in the next chapter? Doing exactly what he said he would never do. But he makes the boldest statements and the boldest actions and then often hasn't really thought it all the way through. So if you think of impetuous as Peter because of Petra, right, the rock. Humility suppresses this movement of hope. So because temperance moderates rashness, humility also moderates rashness of hope, right? Rash hope. Somebody who, I will follow you to the end, and you really haven't thought that all the way through. Maybe you should, but you haven't thought it all the way through. You don't have a plan of attack on that one. Modesty is also part of temperance, so therefore it can be both part of modesty, which is to moderate, right? Modesty is to moderate. Humility moderates hope. So humility can be both part of modesty and temperance since they are both in each other. So it's not a contradiction there. Now, humility is a great virtue, but it is not the greatest virtue. And we see this every time when we get to these issues of temperance. So first, the theological virtues are greater virtues because they more directly aim at our final end, which is eternity with God, right? So faith is more directly related to eternity with God than humility, hope and love as well. Then there's prudence, which deals with reason itself, the right way, the path to get to heaven, right? How it moderates the pathway to heaven. Prudence as an intellectual virtue is higher than the moral virtues. It's the queen of all virtues, right? Prudence. And then justice is higher than temperance because higher than humility within temperance because justice deals with the common good. It deals with the good of many people, right? Especially legal justice deals with the good of the entire commonweal, right? The whole people. So my own personal humility is good for me, but justice is for the good of the entire commonwealth. So justice is a greater good. So after you get through theological virtues, prudence, and justice, humility is above the highest of the other virtues, right? The other moral virtues. It's very high. And one of the reasons is because it, unlike almost every other virtue, where first we would say, is it a virtue? Yes. Is it a special virtue? The answer was usually yes, because it's dealing with something specific. Sobriety dealing with drunkenness, abstinence dealing with food, chastity dealing with sexual activity, right? So these are specific to their issue. Humility is not a special virtue. It is a generalized virtue. So humility applies to all aspects of life, all parts of life, in terms of food, sex, drink, but then also in terms of issues of justice, issues of fortitude. Humility is in all things. So it's very central to the gospel. Humbling oneself, picking up your cross and following me is one of the essential calls of the gospel, is humility, right? Christ's humility before the Father is one of the greatest calls of the gospel. Humility is quite high in terms of the virtues. The last question is the longest of them all, the articles. This is an interesting thing. It would be an interesting paper if somebody hasn't quite done it yet, or even a book. It might be, St. Thomas was going to be, he's from a very affluent family. His uncle was the Pope. He was from a very influential family that could have put him as the head of Monte Cassino Benedictine Abbey, which is the mother house of all Benedictines. He, as a young boy, would have been the abbot of it. So he is very influenced and educated by the Benedictines. He decides not to take this very prestigious place as the abbot of Monte Cassino, and instead he joins this little-known vagabond community of beggars called the Mendicant Order of the Dominicans. This is who he becomes. Ironically, throughout, you consistently see within the Summa Benedictine thought, and very seldom see anything related to the Dominican order. You don't see any quotes of St. Dominic. You don't see any Dominican sources quoted. But frequently you see the Benedictines, which is kind of ironic that all this time he worked so hard not to become a Benedictine, and still he is quite Benedictine in his worldview. Perhaps he's more responding to the religious culture of the time, but he quite a bit of Benedictine spirituality throughout his writings. So in this one, very directly, is humility that kind of hierarchy within the rule of St. Benedict? Now, objection 1 goes through all of these. He goes through 12 rules of humility within the rule of St. Benedict. He then, in his answer, comes up with his own way of kind of secularizing it in a way to make it more universal. I don't mean secular in a non-religious way, but in a non-Benedictine way. And he compares them each. He does only come up with 11, not 12, though. And he goes in reverse order. So he starts with the 11th becomes the first here. So everything is kind of in reverse order, and at the very end he switches around 3 and 1. So the ordering is not that important, I guess. The humility found in the rule of St. Benedict that he thinks is universal is not to follow one's own will. Not regulating your own will by your own superior judgment. Now you could see that in the rule of St. Benedict, it would be following your superior, right? You're following the abbot. Here he's kind of giving it a more universal approach of saying, don't follow your own superior judgment, kind of implicitly saying, follow your superior, right? Follow the judgment that's not within your own head. Not being impatient during difficult situations, opposite being be patient during difficult situations. Acknowledge one's own shortcomings, deeming oneself incapable of all things, right? Consider yourself in a lower state. put others before oneself, not departing from the ordinary way. In the rule it would have said follow the monastic rules of life, follow the rule of Benedict. But he makes it more universal, departing with the ordinary way of holiness, the ordinary way of life. You don't have to create your own path. Follow what works, what has been working for generations. Follow that. Be slow to speak, in some sense be silent. Don't be immoderate in speak. Don't be loud. Don't be boisterous. Be subdued and listen. Be silent. Restrain from haughty looks. Right. This humility goes beyond just talk, but in terms of acts, other acts. Don't be flashy. Don't be showy. And then restrain from senseless mirth and laughter. St. Benedict was often very against this kind of laughter, because you're either laughing at somebody's foolishness or you're making fun of someone. St. Benedict didn't really have an idea of a innocent joke. If people are laughing, they're probably making fun of something. So you better not to laugh at all. And then the last one, which he doesn't mention, which is mentioned in the objections from the rule of St. Benedict, is the fear of God. Have the fear of God. Why he couldn't have found a virtue for that, because I think he clearly could have, I don't know, but he takes the 12 and turns it into 11. And in his beginning of his answer, he says, the important part in general, right? We can go look at these all individually, but in general, it's important not to deem ourselves above what we are. Don't think of yourself as greater than you are. See yourself as you are. That's the goal, right? Humility isn't to turn yourself into nothing, right? To make yourself a doormat. That's not humility. Humility is accurately following who you are, right? Accurately doing what you're able to do. Not trying to do more than you can do, not trying to do less than you can do. And it is all rooted in the reverence we bear to God, right? Why do any of it? If God made you with certain virtues and abilities, for you to fall short is to blaspheme God. To try to do greater than what you did means that you don't trust that God has given you enough to be holy, right? So, and not recognize it in our neighbors is to also blaspheme God, because God has created the others. So it's all rooted in humility. Is all rooted in God. This idea of humility has its root in hummus, right? Humility, hummus. What's hummus? Dirt, right? It's to stay grounded, right? It's not that we are dirt, but that we should have both our feet on the ground and be grounded in our endeavors, right? Kind of our heads in the sky and our feet on the ground, right? That's the ideal in terms of the balance of humility and magnanimity. So in conclusion, humility is a virtue. Humility is a matter of the appetite rather than the intellect, although it is according to reason, right? It has to be according to reason. Humility is subjects itself to God, right? We subject ourselves to God and we serve our brothers and sisters. Humility is part of modesty and temperance because it regulates the passions. Humility specifically moderates the passion of hope, right? Not the theological virtue, but the passion of hope. Humility is a great virtue. It's above most of the virtues, but it is not better than justice or prudence or the theological virtues. And there are degrees of humility, and looking at the rule of St. Benedict is a good guide for kind of living the values of humility, right? If you say, I want to be humble, but I don't know what to do. Well, look to the rule of St. Benedict or the answer to Article 6. You'll get some guidelines for how to live out the degrees of humility. Okay, well, next we move into pride, which is a big question put into a little subpart of temperance. So look forward to that.